Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another episode of The Creative Minority. Here we hope to convene conversations that engage in contemporary issues such as in the realm of philosophy, psychology, and today we have medicine. And so I'm delighted today to have our esteemed guest Dr. Aasim Padela, who is a professor with tenure of emergency medicine, bioethics, and the medical humanities. He's published a number of articles and books related to the topic of Islam and bioethics and medicine. And he's authored over 120 peer reviewed journal articles and book chapters. And he serves in an editorial capacity for the Encyclopedia of Islamic Bioethics, American Journal of Bioethics, and the International Journal of Islam, and many others. I know he wouldn't like me to mention all of them. Um, he has also co-edited a recent book titled Islam in Biomedicine, which is a compilation of many different articles on the subject of Islam in biomedicine. So thank you so much, Dr. Aasim, for joining us.
Barakallah fikum. It is great to be here. Alhamdulillah.
So today, inshallah, I'd like to touch upon the topic of Islamic bioethics. It's a topic which I hear not so often, but one which I feel, especially in the realm of fiqh, there's a lot of very interesting questions that emerge from it. You know, what is the ruling on organ donation, for instance? What is the ruling of if a person decides not to do chemotherapy, but that could most likely lead to death, and so forth. And now abortion is obviously one which has been around for a while, but has now become quite prominent. So, just as an introductory, Dr. Asim, do you mind just giving an explanation, an introduction into the realm of Islamic bioethics?
Sure. Alhamdulillah. So it's a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, I do some work on Islamic bioethics, and I think for us to think about that uh, as an academic, I have to break the terms down a bit of what Islamic bioethics is or what it could be. And we have a conjunction of two terms, right? Islam and bioethics. So if I were to give you the academic definition or one that I've written in a book, it would be that it is a discourse between the tradition of Islam and ethical or moral issues arising from biomedical practice, right? Or even biomedical science. Uh, that would be the academic definition. And the way I say that is because it's a discourse, meaning that it has a history, right? And inshallah, it will have a future. And we are participants in that discourse. The thing that you mentioned, I think, interestingly, and I'm going to start off with what it is not, right? Like we often do uh,
Mhm.
uh, when we try definitions, what it is not. It is not fiqh of medicine.
Mhm.
Although in the main mindset of individuals, we start off thinking about the fiqh of medicine. I think we do that interestingly because we're very comfortable with the notion that our tradition has a very highly developed science of how to understand divine intent and will, right?
Mhm.
And by doing so, then prescribe for individuals how to live their lives, which would be Islamic law. Therefore, we automatically say, okay, Islamic law is the sole determinant of how to live. Therefore, when we think about ethics, that's how to live. Therefore, fiqh is what we need to look at. But I would say that that's not necessarily the case because when you think about bioethics, right, the meaning of Islam with bioethics, bioethics is in the contemporary age, is a field that only has a history perhaps 60 years, 70 years, which is a field that involves both moral philosophy, legal sort of epistemology, law, positive law, ethics, as we think about ethics, right? How to be. It has multiple tiers. So there's policy level ethics. There's right individual level ethics, and conversations. There's guidelines. So it's a field that's very much. It's very broad, more expansive potentially than what we think about as just what is a fiqh question. The fiqh question is, can I or can I not do something? Does it accord with divine intent and will and like flourishing, right? And human flourishing. Well, ethics is more than that. Even in our Islamic tradition, we think ethics is more than that. So as I said, what is it not? So it is not immediately mapping one-to-one. Fiqh of medicine is not equal to Islamic bioethics. But what Islamic bioethics would be is, as I said, is a discourse that involves aspects of fiqh of medicine, right? Aspects of adab, right? How do I not only how can I do something, but how do I best do something, right? And then aspects of what I would say the end goal, right? So what is the goal of my action? So it involves three things: the agent level action, right? Act-based morality fiqh. The act-based morality fiqh, agent-based adab, and then the third would be goal. What do I want to achieve? Which some people would say maybe a little bit of maqasid. We can get into that if you like. Inshallah, I have a book coming out on maqasid and biomedicine. I don't think maqasid exactly does it, at least how we think of it now, because it still resides around the ambit of fiqh. But what are the goals we want to achieve? So that's how bioethics and Islamic bioethics has to think about it, as a multiplicity of views around what should be actions involving those three dimensions.
Okay,
You can
so
allow
this
me to speak
this
for
is
a second. So I spoke a long time. So please now, exact, yeah.
No, I just wanted to say, I'm glad you made that correction early on because in my mind, usually when we people who aren't in the field think of bioethics, they're really talking about, you know, what are things that are ethical in the medical sphere and what are things that aren't. And from the Muslim standpoint, they're usually thinking of fiqh. So, what is the ruling on this? Can I do this or not? Can I do this or not? And so, it's interesting that from the outset, you're mentioning that there's more than just the fiqh. Bioethics is more than just fiqh.
Yeah, if Islam was to meet bioethics, right, which is what the whole idea is, right? When we say something, Islamic finance, we're saying there's a world of finance out there. There's discipline of finance out there. There are ways things are happening in the financial realm. What does the Islamic tradition have to say about that, right? So if
Hmm.
we're doing this model of, I'll have two models to share with you, but if you're doing a model of Islam visiting bioethics, what ends up happening is we say, okay, well, the thing that we know can visit is fiqh and a scholar of fiqh, and so we'll rule it based on what Muslims can do. But then have you thought about how society should deal with those things? Have you
Hmm.
thought about non-Muslim actors? Have you thought about beyond the act of the individual? What does that mean for the healthcare system? Potentially not, right? So
Hmm.
we're only partially visiting the world of bioethics. As I said, bioethics is a lot of things. It's an academic field, it's a practice, it's multiplicity. And to address each of those levels requires use a broader lens of fiqh. Fiqh is an understanding, not fiqh as just a legal ruling.
Hmm.
And then if we're going to say the opposite, okay, it's not us visiting the realm of bioethics. We want to construct up an ethical paradigm from the tradition of Islam. Islamic ethics has more than just law. As I just said,
Hmm.
adab, tasawwuf, akhlaqiyat. I mean, we have a lot of different registers, and then as we think about the morality of actions, we have to bring all of that together. We don't do that either. So on both ends, right, whether it's a visitation model, visiting the world of bioethics, or if it's a native model, we want to
Hmm.
construct up an Islamic bioethical framework, we shortchange both. And
Hmm.
that's what I'm trying to convey, right? So it is not fiqh of medicine, but even if it was an Islamic bioethics, we don't use all of Islam to adjudicate that. And to me,
Hmm.
those failures lead to two things. One, that we don't have a response to contemporary society, right? Two, it leaves Muslim agents, be they patients, physicians, chaplains, imams, only seeing part of the whole.
Hmm.
And I think that makes us, right, in the words of some, so when we talk about transforming the world, we can't transform. We just simply react, and we react only partially at a one time. So we live in the realm of contingency, right, as opposed to in the realm of aspirational, transformational aspects. What can Islam offer the world?
Hmm. Yeah, so Dr. Awesome, one thing that I realized is with many of these new sciences that have begun to emerge in recent years, whether it's Islamic psychology, Islamic finance, Islamic medicine, prophetic medicine, many of these disciplines, um, the way many lay people understand it is that they take the paradigm as it exists from the West, not understanding all the different ideologies that are embedded within it as its first principles, and then they take certain aspects of Islam and then they place it within Islam and they say this is a discipline. So, for instance, you know, I wrote an article on Islamic psychology, just condensing some of the ideas of Dr. Malik Bedri and his book, The Dilemma of the Muslim Psychologist. And I just relayed his arguments. And this is the founder of the discipline of Islamic psychology. And he laid out his criticisms of psychology today, of Western psychology in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of Muslim students in the realms of psychology critique my response And their critique was based on this idea that they believed that Western psychology was Islamic. And so they would take ideas in Western psychology, such as positive and negative reinforcement, and say, oh, well, this is paradise, this is hell. So clearly, this is Islamic, right? But they forget that the paradigm that they're operating in oftentimes has these first principles. So with bioethics, is this something that we're seeing as well, that Muslims are starting to just project ideas of Islam, or are they starting to begin from the ground up onwards?
Very good question. So I appreciate the clarification. So I have two ways to respond to that, I think. One is we have to recognize that people need to live. A tradition that does not have the ability to address people's questions in pressing moments is a tradition that has no motive force upon human behavior,
Mm-hmm.
right? So as I said previously, okay, we live in contingencies, but you have to live in contingencies because someone's trying to live, right? We can't wait for the fully baked response, particularly in bioethics when there are issues of that are really pressing and urgent. You have to answer the question very quickly, or at least right some response quickly. So I think that there's a functional sort of need, and so I wouldn't critique the idea per se that we should be responsive to the paradigm that exists and help fit in some Islamic morality where we can, because people need to live, right? And the job of ulama, I would say, in the broad sense, right, or I should say, just say fuqaha, is to lift up the burden of sin from individuals where there is no clear qat'i notion that there will be sin, and even if that means some, let's say, not the best logical reasoning involved, if they do that, and I think that's important. That's why fatwa is not a hukum; it's an exceptional circumstance. Okay, but if we continue to live in that, then the generations behind us don't see anything above, right? These are instruments to get at a goal, as I said, right? But if you just keep on using instruments, you never see what the goal might be, then you have no vision of what that looks like. And I think that's the issue, that we think it's okay. We think it's okay forever to live in this contingency. And that's one critique, right? So I agree with you in that sort of domain that, hey, look, we have to start thinking about first principles, the notion of the human being that's embedded within psychology, for example, right? Or the notion of governance that's embedded within Islamic political science, right? Or whatever. Or even in the way that healthcare is structured in society, right? When we talk about ethics of bioethics, well, how
Mm-hmm.
should we think about the notion of health and well-being, right? These incredibly important concepts, right? Living and dying, definitions of life and death, before to actually then think about what that looks like in society. So I agree that that's a intellectual project from first principles up that needs to be undertaken. I wouldn't dismiss the incredibly important on the spot, right,
Mm-hmm.
answers, right? So we would say there's strategic thinking and tactical thinking. Tactically, I got to address the issue now, but I need
Okay.
strategical thinking to move forward. But I would push back against a modern Muslim notion right now. Two, one of them is we got to throw everything out, right? We got to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I
Mm-hmm.
find it very romantic notion from individuals, both of a scholarly class or the professional class or a lay people, who simply reject everything because we think, right, that everything is embedded within a worldview that is antithetical to Islam. I say that because Islam didn't come to reject everything that came before it, right? The Rasul didn't do that in his
Mm-hmm.
practice, right? And the Quran didn't detail everything. He allowed things to happen. Urf still remains a legitimate source of law, not the first, not the second, but remains. Adat muhakkamat, right? As the Qaeda says. So my point is, for us to do that is problematic, right? To throw everything out. The other thing is that then we think we have something to replace it with. And I would say that's also problematic. We're going to create an Islamic state. Tell me, how are you going to deal with the financial system? Period.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. We don't have one. We have nothing to replace. So there's a very easy to deconstruct. It's very hard to construct, and oftentimes to construct, we don't even know the tools by which we would construct. So it's very easy for people to say, hey, look, everything is wrong. They think about corrupt, they're corrupt, and society is capitalistic, and so on and so forth. Well, there are Muslims who thought Islamic communism was the way to go when capitalism was on the rise. What happened to
Mm-hmm.
that? Islamic socialism, right? We have always had these fads. So I think that we should be very cognizant. If you're going to critique a field, know the tools, instruments, and knowledge frameworks of that field. If you're going to then replace it with something Islamic, quote unquote, then know the epistemology of Islam within it, insert it inside and out, and recognize that everything wasn't to be labeled Islamic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example of why that comes in. We all like to talk about these days theology, and we talk about, right, Maturidi, Ash'ari, and Mu'tazili thought. Well, if the idea is that only the lawgiver labels things as Islamic, right? By fiat, he labels things Islamic, and we know there's only certain canonical texts that give that measure. Then everything else you say is non-Islamic. I mean, would you say that everything we do is non-Islamic then? There were in our tradition individuals who said if it doesn't reside, like if it doesn't reside in the text specifically, then actually live your life, right? So my point is, our tradition had these. But when people are critiquing, throw the baby out with the bathwater, they won't say let's go and be like the Athari people and let's or the school and let's take it to a house. They won't say that because they're inconsistent in their logic.
But I understand what you're saying, Dr. Aasim, but from what I hear from people who do make this argument that we need to throw everything out, they're usually people who aren't deep within the discipline. They're usually outsiders who are usually making these broad statements that, oh,
No. I mean, the COVID pandemic showed that clearly. You can go there if you like.
mm-hmm.
But we
Give me an
had
example.
individuals from our scholarly class engaging in conversations saying that, right, the pharmaceutical company is out for money. Okay, that might be the case, but that does not mean throw everything out they give you. Stop taking the Panadol or the
Mm-hmm. Okay.
acetaminophen, right? Just don't take the vaccine. Right? You see my point? Like there was a strained logic. Let's talk about you want to read papers? Let's talk about papers. Let's talk about epistemology, right? Let's talk about epistemology and then epidemiology. Read the paper. Let's talk about how it's come together, how we think about statistics. But no notion of statistics. Someone said this, someone said that, they're equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is the modern crisis. You set up the sheikh on Google who gives a good YouTube talk as the same as someone spent 20 years. You wouldn't do that in fiqh, but you would do that in every other field. And I want to get off my soapbox, but I'm telling you that for me, right, if you're going to have a full-baked critique, do what Imam al-Ghazali did. Maqsad, right? Maqasid al-falsafa. Before he wrote the Tahafut, what was the first thing? I'm going to understand the field from inside. And have peer review of what I wrote about the field so that I'm not misgiven.
So basically, what you're saying is now that you've written all these books, you're gonna write your rad soon, your refutation.
I need to write a run. But you see my point. That is our tradition. We don't take things and just say, a surface level. We go deep. And we have pillars of that in our tradition. It's a discourse.
So I guess the ultimate thing is there's a balance, and like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Al-hikmatu dhalat al-mu'min, فحيث وجدها فهو أحق بها." Right. So wherever you find wisdom, you take it because it's most belonging to the believer. So I'm not in a position to challenge you on any of these.
But I think the word you just said, that his qawl is very interesting. What is the word you said? Hikmah. What's hikmah?
Wisdom.
Right. Okay, let's say English, but he didn't say ilm. Right?
Yeah.
He didn't say information. Let's just be English. He didn't say information. He didn't say data. He said wisdom. Wisdom is implicative of knowledge. Where you find wise usage of knowledge, right? That's how Muslims should be. We find wise people, not informational streams, not data stores. So it requires to move beyond. This is my point.
It's very interesting. I never even questioned the word, right? Because we just translate it as knowledge, right? But it's actually, I mean, you don't really think about it because wisdom is learning when to apply the right ruling in the right instance.
Yeah.
Right? Anyway, so you mentioned many contemporary issues. What are some of the contemporary issues that Islamic biomedicine seeks to engage with?
You mean Islamic bioethics?
Sorry, Islamic bioethics.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that those who are in the field of creating responses to the field of bioethics, all these topics, all topics, right? So, they're the ones that have never been fully closed, like when what is life and what is death. They're ones that are newer. We want to talk about AI, right? And how we use AI responsibly, right? In the United States context, there's been a reopening the notion of abortion because of what happened. So I think that there was a good study. I don't remember, but there was I think by Nuffield Council of Bioethics in the UK, that talks about, here are for the next 50 years, here are the top issues we think are going to happen, and that are going to have bioethical relevance, and then Muslims sort of write on that. So I can't. I mean, I think
Okay.
there's so many issues to talk about that have never been closed, right? And they just push boundaries. Let me though, however, give this idea that we talked about the other collection that came out, Islam Biomedicine, and inshallah we have another couple of things coming out as well. I think that bioscience pushes our understanding of the human being in ways no other science does. The human being, what we think of the human being, and I'll give you examples. I would say there are 5 fundamental existential questions of the human being. What's its origin? Bioscience is an answer for that. What is it? Bioscience is an answer for that. What's its capacities? Bioscience. Is it unique? Bioscience is an answer for that, right? What is this feature? Bioscience is an answer for that, right? Evolution, right? Where it came from, right? What is it? It's a mechanistic body, right? It's supervenience to create consciousness upon the main brain functions, right? What's its capacities? We have codes to tell us what your predilections will be for genetic codes, for example, right? Epigenetics after that, environmental factors. What's its future? It'll become what? Dirt, decomposed, be recycled, right? Is it unique in the universe? Well, maybe exotheology will tell us whether, right? But we say maybe there are other mukallafs in the universe. Maybe AI will be mukallaf, right? It has the capacity. Bioscience pushes our understandings of the human being in ways we don't fathom. So we do bioethics, but those notions of the human being lead to the questions of ethical import.
Mm-hmm.
So your notion of awaliyat, let's figure out those concepts, right? We can talk about health, disease, life, death. What's the human being? Then we can start talking about bioethics.
You just proposed an interesting question, right? Whether or not AI could be mukallaf, whether they could be held liable, and if I think all these movies, these sci-fi movies in the '90s and 2000s, they were really people who saw what the future was going to be, or they were trying to push people into this direction. But so you mentioned AI. Not recently, but you were at a conference on AI in bioethics, I believe, in Pakistan some time ago. You mind just sharing anything related to the topic of AI and bioethics?
Well, I mean, that was I think Islamic Ethics and AI. That was a
Okay.
conference. Colleagues of mine, Dr. Junaid Qadir and Aman al-Qib, sort of held that up. And I think they were just trying to figure out an ethical framework, right? One coming from computer science, one coming from Islamic ethics. What is an ethical framework for how we responsibly use AI techniques? Now, they were not talking about general AI or super, right, or like sort of sentient AI. They were talking about how do we use techniques of AI responsibly, because there are ethical issues, right?
Give me some
You have to,
issues.
yeah, maximizing functions. Do we maximize safety, right? Do you maximize utilitarian functions? Do you what sort of principles govern that? And they wanted to create a framework by which Islamic principles would be used and meshed in those sort of uses of AI, right? That was the conference. I think what was interesting for me being there, mashallah, may Allah bless the people who put it on and the people in Pakistan. There's a real appetite at the school for people, right? Young students want to engage with these topics. And alhamdulillah, there were some ulama who gave some talks at the conference. Also, it was really interesting, and that they're trying to come up with a multidisciplinary approach. But it was the same thing that we're disconnected from centers where these things are produced. Right. So just unfortunately or fortunately, we're right. But unfortunately, we are disconnected from the centers of knowledge producing AI techniques, right, from the get-go. We're responding to something that's happening in Silicon Valley. And we're responding with the individuals that we have. They're using certain vocabularies that may or may not actually mesh with how the field has moved forward, right? So I want to say to you that yes, we have techniques. Historically, we talked about automation, right? Scholars have written about automated things. Can we do wudu with a machine? Like all these things they've talked about, but the discourse is at a really elementary level, right? Can we make an AI machine that has a face, or is this going to be the surah business from our creating surahs like we did talked about painting, right, or photos?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a 40-year-old discourse. I mean, that's not the issue that we're dealing with, but the vocabularies by which they're engaging, or the imagination with which they're engaging, still is somewhat dated from what's actually happening tomorrow in Silicon Valley, right?
I mean, we're so detached. I mean, if you read some of the reports of the Pentagon, right, and the Pentagon is the information that's released from the Pentagon is like 5, 10 years old,
Right.
but they've already released information of them trying to create these robot soldiers
Correct.
which are humans, but they have these shoes that they can run in which they're running, I think, like 50, 60 kilometers in. They're making changes to the body, and so this is information that's out there, and so the question is well, what's the information that hasn't been shared, and how far ahead are they of us? So you're
Right.
saying that the questions that like you dealt with at that conference are really like 40, 50-year-old questions.
Well, they didn't deal. They were trying to come up with a framework, right? Because they recognize, the individuals recognize these are questions. To get to answer those contemporary questions, we first have to get people to understand where the history is, what are the
Okay.
questions are, and then move forward, right? So they wanted to create a historical trajectory and get the right sort of working group and dynamics and methodologies together, and not simply do, which my talk was like, oh, not simply do what we've done. If you want to learn from Islamic bioethics, learn that it's not simply fiqh. All right, learning you need multidisciplinary, it is disciplinarity, right? Learn that you have to understand the epistemology of the science itself, right? You have to be connected with the industry. So that was my sort of thing, that if you want to learn, don't say the model is Islamic finance, or Islamic bioethics, or Islamic psychology. You might have to come up with a different one, but there are certain failures of those fields that you can now engage with, right?
Hmm.
Learn from, so that you engage in a different way. Um, Alhamdulillah, it was a great conference. It was interesting. As I said to you, I was amazed by the young students and doctoral students who were kind of engaged with these topics.
Hmm. And I think that is definitely with the age of technology that we live in. Um, there are a lot of pressing issues, and AI is definitely one of the ones. With some people believing that AI will lead to the end of humanity.
Even
Um,
AI itself believes that. I tweeted that about that. So
we did a podcast titled "Transhumanism: The Death of Humanity."
right.
If anybody's interested, which we went more in depth into AI. But yeah, so I want to shift the conversation a bit now to some of the questions which I've had for some time. There was a lady, a sister very close to me, who Allah have mercy on her, Allah grant her shifa, who has cancer.
I mean,
And so she had once asked me, whether or not it was permissible for her not to take chemotherapy, knowing that if she didn't take chemo, she would die. So my question to you is just on this topic of near-death treatment. Do you mind just sharing some thoughts?
sure. So may Allah make it easy for her and those who are in similar states where they need to have guidance, right? And I'll say that obviously I'm not gonna I'm not in a position to give fatwas on this topic, but I do think that individuals should consult their scholars who they trust, who are well read and can give them fatwas with particular circumstances. But I can share with you the fundamental building blocks of a response to that question, right? And what has already been an accepted what's the word, orthopraxy within the fuqaha around notions of health, of not pursuing medical treatment. So at the base level, we should recognize, for various reasons, that seeking medical treatment has not been judged to be, in the Sunni tradition, a fard, right? It's not wajib. You're not sinful for not seeking, for various reasons, including the notion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who can control, or sends anzal dawa, right? He sends out illness and cure, and he can cure people without the need for taking medication per se, or treatments, right? So that recognition that it's his dominion, as Ibrahim says, "Wa huwa yashfini" in the Quran. So that's the notion. One. Secondly, Rasulullah, all he did command individuals, and the command form is used, tadawu ya ibadullah, right? Um, that was taken as a recommendation, so not follow the wajib, but as a recommendation within the Shafi school. Other schools said that was just a irshadi. Um, and they did not want to, and they said that because they weren't sure that the treatment would bring about cure, right? There was at that time, and even now, that there is a lack of full certainty about treatment giving you cure. There are other things as well. I mean, I can expound on that if you like. But that led to this baseline hukum that is not followed except for when it's life-saving and there's certainty about or curing or relieving some symptoms from the disease, right? So that's the level of certainty. Now, some people will say, scholars, certainty means certainty, yaqini, 100%. Some there's a ghalabat al-dhann, greater than 51% or 51% or greater. That's where the conversation still occurs today. So then, applying that to the case, when I'm asked to be an ethics consultant, I say, okay, well, what are the doctors telling you, right? So doctors' language again, right? Our language, interestingly, we have a very fine language around nuanced around epidemiology and prognostication. We actually have data to tell us. So are they saying that you should? Are they saying they recommend? Are they saying that this is what will happen based on case series or data? So if the right and that would then set the ruling in motion. So the woman does not necessarily need to take medical treatment when she's saying she will certainly die. Well, then the question is now, is this life saving, right? And is that certainly will die, right? And what is that certainty behind that? So I think that's the interrogation people need to do. I will say, even then, it becomes a challenge of, okay, well, who is the decision maker? So when we say certainly will die, right, is it that you are culpable for yourself, right? So say this, I'm going to ad lib to case. The individual says, I don't want to take treatment, but then she becomes unconscious, and her husband, right, or her son or whatever is now the one who's in caretaking responsibility, is the wali of. That's a different hukum now for the wali than it was for her. You couldn't force her to take some treatment, but now you're the wali. You have to think about her best interests, and do you override, right, what she said, because you are also now sinful if you don't follow through something that's wajib, right? So it becomes much more nuanced that they're different actors. Or the physician, say it was a Muslim physician. How do you counsel a patient who's refusing care? Okay, fine, but now what about your moral culpability to give them full treatment if it has to be? So that's kind of the way I do ethics consults. First, think about what the science is telling you, then the boundary positions from our tradition. Then let's work through your case and play out each scenario to see what the moral dimensions are for each actor, and then we can help think about where you should go. And in the end, obviously, the mukallaf is the mukallaf, right? They're the ones who have to be responsible. So, it's their choice. We just advise.
There's a number of interesting questions that emerge from here. So, for instance, you have this individual who believes that who has been diagnosed with cancer and has stated that they don't want treatment, knowing that their friend circle around them, there's been people who have taken chemotherapy and who have passed away. The doctor has said that it's already stage 3, right? So like for this specific individual, like it's stage 3 already when they found out. So the doctors will say there's a low percent, 10-20% chance that you'll actually overcome it. In this instance, the individual now if the individual decides that they don't want to take it, it would be it would be fine, correct?
Well, that's what you're asking me for a fatwa, and I'm going to give one. I'm giving you the boundary positions to think about, right?
I'm thinking
But,
hypothetical. I'm thinking
no,
hypothetical.
but it's still the boundary positions, right? Because you have to take rulings and then specify them to a case. I mean, that's how our tradition works, right? So what you have to think about the case. So playing out the other dimensions that you added. So let's take this. So this 10 to 20% chance of what? Are we talking about survival? Right?
Survival.
We're talking about 5-year survival. We're talking about 1-year survival, and we also know that beyond medical treatments in our tradition, there's an ontology, there's a schema of how you get about healing, right? We say, let's go drink Zamzam, right? And there's shifa, we know, right? There are other ways about which we can seek healing or cure from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when the patient's saying, I don't want treatment, are they saying, I don't want this specific chemo modality, I want other modalities that are more consistent in line with my tradition? Or she's saying, I don't want to do anything.
I don't want chemo.
We see. So my point is now, okay, well then now that we think about it, we don't want chemo, and is the chemo reason because I think there are side effects from chemo, or is it because I think the chemo is just not efficacious? So are there alternate ways to think, okay, well, they can change the chemo regimen, or you can do something, right? Something else. Maybe there are other treatments that people take, adjuvant therapies, for example. So it becomes very fine and specific to the case, and you can't sort of say, yeah, you don't have to, like, you don't have to take treatment. But if the issue is one of ease, convenience, facilitation, or if it's like, I don't believe this chemo regimen will work, okay, and the doctor's telling you that there is no basis that it's going to save your life, or there's a minimal change between the 5-year survival, okay, right? I mean, that's my point, where it has to be at this case level, which is also why I'm demonstrating for you and your audience that blanket fatwas this is really problematic. And individuals who cannot interrogate the data flows, informational streams, shouldn't be giving fatwa in these domains. My view. I'm not saying I'm giving fatwa. I'm saying, but you have to figure out these multiple levels, right? So when we give, hey, okay, you don't have to take treatment, or what is the case involving? What's the question that they're answering? What data has the doctor provided? It's a dialogue. And oftentimes muftis are not involved in that dialogue with the patient or the provider, can't ask the right questions, then you get these weird answers, right?
So some people, for instance, will say, I'm in this position where where the doctor's saying to do chemo, but Islamically, I don't have to take chemo, and
Right.
so therefore I'm just gonna sit this one out, maybe do some hijama, drink some Zamzam water, and that's it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, right? That might be a viable option for someone because they're living right now. They're not applying an immediate treatment that's life-saving, right? Because why are we saying this life-saving thing? Because you're not morally allowed in our tradition to take your own life, right? And there are various allowances, even if the case becomes where you're taking haram things to save your life, where some fiqh says it's actually obligatory to take. Some won't say that. Many won't say that, right? So the point of all of that is to what remove sin from the individual. So the individual says, hey, look, this particular instance is not one of life-saving quality with certainty. Okay. And medicine is all about not having certainty, right? About certain things. I mean, about most things. But in certain realms, there is certainty, right? In certain areas, we can say, hey, here's the epidemiological data that you don't do this. I'll give you an example that's more clear cut, right? So say someone, take your chemotherapy out of it. Say someone says that I don't want to have a tracheostomy. I can't breathe. They're on a ventilator. They don't want the ventilator. And after 3 weeks, usually we want to take you, or less than sometimes, take you up in a tracheostomy here because that causes infectious risk, right? And you have to be sedated. But if you have a tracheostomy, you don't need to be on sedation, right? And it's much easier to has lower risk of infection. So someone says, I don't want the surgery to have a tracheostomy. Okay. And okay, you don't want to have the surgery for having tracheostomy. Doctor says, well, we can't there's a higher risk for you to be on a ventilator and you're on a bed for you're already been in the ICU for this. You'll be sedated the entire time. But the person says, I don't want a surgery. So now the doctors say, we can't put you on the vent any longer because it's causing you harm. You have infections. We need to do this. You say, I don't want to do it. That's a life-saving question, right? Because if you said, I don't want the surgery, what's going to happen? You will die because you can't keep someone on a vent that long without having harms, right? You will die. So when the situation is now, I will die, and I certainly know that if I'm not able to breathe, right, I will die, then what's the hukum there? There's no, okay, option. This clear cut, you will die. I'm telling you, you will die. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might have a miracle, but the point is that if we can't get you off a vent and you don't want the machine and the surgery, you will die. Now tell me the moral culpability. Now, if someone says, I don't want to do it, okay. But we're just trying to tell you where sin might reside. Allah alim. But that's sinful, potentially, because of a clear notion of what will happen, right? Not many cases are like that, right? But that's why our tradition sort of says you have to have that yaqini, life-saving notion.
So in that instance, if you know that you know that out of yaqeen, out of 100% certainty, that if, for example, somebody gets into a car accident and now they need to have surgery, and they have to be paralyzed for their entire life, but by doing the surgery they will survive.
And without the surgery, they will die.
Yeah.
Right.
But doing the surgery will make them paralyzed and live, stuck in a bed for their entire life.
So that is the question of, well, we have a problem here because in the Islamic tradition, although I've written a paper and some scholars say there's this notion, what is quality of life, right? Is any life quality of life, ultimate quality of life, or are there gradations of quality of life? But I won't have this. You have the absolute right to say, I don't want this, right? I mean, no one's going to, if there's a measure we can tell you that we think as advisors, that religious advisors, that you might be sinning should you do that. But there's many sins people do.
But this is a sin to
But
take
my,
life.
no, okay, but hifz nafs is not the, it's not the, in my reading, is not the ultimate value, right? Actually, in the maqasid, hifz ad-din might be, hifz
Mhm,
al-Islam. So this would be a fall into hifz al-Islam, right? But my point being, we're both come together. But my point being here that there's someone else has to do something to prevent someone from taking that action, right? We don't lock people up
mhm,
who make do sin. So if they're going to sin, they're going to sin, and we're going to say maybe that's sinful. Maybe you make tawbah, maybe whatever, and maybe you won't have time to make tawbah because you'll die. I don't. My point
mhm,
is that you're not going to force someone to live in a state where they are already adamant about not doing that. Right? There's an interesting classic case in bioethics called the case of Dax that we learned about, where someone sustained enormous amount of burns in their body, and his caregivers, I forgot who it was, but his parents or whatever, really put him through the ringer to get skin grafts and rehab and all this other stuff. And you see these videos, they're online, him screaming, yelling, I don't want this, I don't want this, I'm in pain, right? For months and weeks. Then you flip 5 years later and the person's like, I think he said, I'm glad, I don't remember the exact word, but I'm thankful for life. Similarly, people are paralyzed, and may Allah protect us all.
I mean,
People, there's studies on this. They imagine what being paralyzed will look like, and they are like, this would be horrible. But then when you ask them later on, when they are paralyzed, what their quality of life is or how they're living, they're grateful or they're thankful. For me, for you as a Muslim, you might say one moment of being able to make istighfar might be the worth of all my life, right? If I had that one moment to be sincere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by that one moment or that one act I did, I get Jannah. I mean, we have so many narrations of that. Maybe that is what we need, one moment of clear-mindedness, if I can find that one moment. But maybe for others it's not, like, Allah take me, and we make this dua that we were taught by Rasulullah. I mean, if there's khair in life, right, keep me here. If there's no khair in death, then keep death wafatani, right? And tawafal khair minni, right? So if khair li, right? So if there is death that is better for me, then bring about death. I mean, our tradition is balanced. Rasulullah taught this dua.
mhm, mhm. But I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that there is just this one opinion? Like in this instance, if you know that there's yaqeen, you have to be doing this.
So what I'm saying, and the boundary position is this: that only wajib or farad is when there is notion that two or well, okay, I'm giving you the classic opinion. I'll give you the more contemporary, but the classical opinion, right? And readers can look up papers on this, right? There's a paper by myself and Sheikh Omar on this, and there's others on this specific rulings. Goes to the four madhahib in the Sunni school. Uh, if treatment is known to be life-saving, because the analogy used is of an individual who's bleeding to death, they know they can stop their bleeding by applying some sort of salve or tying a ligature or whatever, right? Tourniquet. They refuse to do so. That is judged to be someone who's culpable for suicide. That's the boundary point, right? So someone who knows that treatment exists and that can be applied with ghalabat al-dhan, some would say, or yaqeen, to stop that, you are deemed sinful, the sin being levied similar to that of committing suicide.
Hmm.
Okay?
Okay. Yeah.
So that sets up the bar is high and you know the treatment. Beyond that, right, you're not required necessarily to have apply any sort of treatment. The other marker that I've used, and that I've used to sort of say, is the quality of life thing we just talked about, right? And so generally, if an individual, what is life saving? Life saving could be any sort of life, right? But perhaps one that I often talk about is the notion of being able to regain mukallaf status. So someone being in a state of paralyzed is still in mukallaf, right? But as someone being in this liminal state of minimal conscious for the rest of whatever, right? Maybe they won't have mukallaf status,
Hmm.
therefore they're not able to change their afterlife by being in that state. And we know that every treatment, scholars say every treatment impacts your hurma and karama, the sanctity and inviolability of the body. Every treatment in that state, right? So those harms might accrue and overweigh the benefits of treatment that is judged to be futile, because you have to, IV is harming the integrity of the body, right? Being in the ICU, being in the hospital. So you have to balance the hurma and karama of the individual being violated by the benefits of the treatment. If the treatment is not known to have benefits, particularly if they're not life-saving benefits, then you're okay to forego. And, and as I said, I think that the reason for that is because the ulama and the fuqaha don't want to levy sin on everybody. Because imagine if they said, no, you have to take treatment when we know it's beneficial. That would mean that everybody's sinning for not taking, Tylenol, or whatever else, right? It would be very hyper sort of notion, hyper religiousness.
And just quickly, Dr. Asim, what was the name of the article that you and Dr. Omar wrote?
Yeah. Uh, I think it's called "We Can But Must We," right? Reasoning exercises of scholars. I think that's called "We Can But Must We." And then there's another article where he's the lead author, in Zygon, I believe, about the same issue.
Okay.
But I would have to look up the titles.
Okay.
But
Please
if
send them
you
to
go on
me.
Google
And then,
Scholar and they look up Qureshi and Padela, you'll find it so far.
and I'll link them in the bio for this podcast. But Dr. Asim, the reason why I keep stressing this is because for me, you know, I just imagine someone who's in that position, who has to make such a difficult situation. Maybe it's on behalf of themselves, or maybe it's on behalf of someone else, and perhaps that decision could, and that decision is life threatening. So, for instance, if I make the wrong decision, I might be held accountable for suicide. Or if I'm held accountable for somebody else, and I deem that, I don't want, something within a person's body, and that they're being paralyzed, and so I deem without their permission that, they should just be put down, then am I
Yeah.
liable for murder?
Right. That's that. Yeah.
Right?
Right. Right. Liable for culpable homicide. Right.
Exactly. So I
Yeah.
think these are very terrifying questions, and on top of that, associated with these major,
But
major sins.
so let me make it less terrifying. Withdrawing or withholding life support, which is the way that most individuals die in the United States. Right. 2 million of the 2.5 million deaths in the United States each year occur by conversations around withdrawing or withholding life support. Okay, 80%, almost. Withdrawing are different things, but the question is, okay, well, if I withhold life support, then they're going to die, right? If I withdraw life support, they're going to die, right? But the question is, does medicine offer something other to restore that individual to a different state? So when you're thinking about this is terrifying because I'm culpable, okay, yeah. So if you think that there's a treatment that someone can be restored, right? That's the point of medicine, to restore people to health, and we refuse to do that for that individual, then you should feel this weighty, right? Whether that be because someone said don't do it, or whether because we feel we're worried about financial constraints or whatever else it might be, right? So it is a weighty decision, and you should feel that way. But the ulama have made it easy for you to think about taking recommendations from physicians and others who are expert in that domain of whether or not this treatment or this course of action is going to restore individuals to a life worth living. They're not asking you to maintain someone in an ICU and sedation, right, ad nauseum until something catastrophic happens. That the point is to circumscribe the zone of obligation to a very small area so you can live your lives and have other determinants influence that decision making. Because if you open that, yeah, okay, well, by the general notion, life saving, that means, okay, someone's living, they have a heartbeat, they're living. Keep everything going until that heartbeat's gone. You can imagine a society like that. We would have Muslim societies don't have the finances to do that. What burden that would be. And so that the point is to lift your burden, not to right to make you weigh down, but the weightiness of the decision, yeah. Because if at one point is individual suicide, the other is homicide. So how do I get rid of that sin? By doing something that's within the fold of the tradition. and maybe I'm overplaying it because at the end of the day, but I don't want to give a crass answer to your audience, right? By saying, okay, yeah, Mashi, just live your life. I want you to recognize that these are big decisions, which is why individuals who are asking these questions need to really write it all down and think, well, what is the question I'm asking? And those who are giving advice should also have weightiness, right? Of what are we at? What am I talking about?
Hmm. So essentially, you're saying that for the people who are listening, if they're in a position like this, you would say that uh, they would need to consult with both doctors and their local fuqaha, their
Yeah,
imams.
because we have to ask the right question. Oftentimes we're not skilled. So one of my big projects is about around death decisions. We as a community, when we're told to make much mention of the destroyer of pleasures, right? That we don't do that. We don't talk about death. We don't talk about what our end is. We don't talk about how. We don't talk about what a good death looks like, right? But we have all this in our all these recommendations in our tradition about that. And so we reached this point of being in the hospital and not know what to do. We never had a conversation. No one's written anything down. Even if you didn't write it down, right? That's okay, but no one talked about it. And so now we're like, okay, well, the doctors say this, doctors say that, and then we ask someone who doesn't understand, biostatistics or doesn't understand what they were talking about, and then we use wrong information to make decisions, and then we all feel bad. I mean, that's the normal output of these
Mhm.
conversations. So I'm saying think about it in advance, right? Have conversations in advance. What would you like to, what does death look like to you? What's a good death look like to you? What are the sorts of questions that we should know about, right? Whether it's about organization you mentioned, or whether about what kind of, death you deem is death in the tradition. So I'll give you listeners a project that I have not been able to embark upon, but we want to embark upon it. Um, involves three things. One, one is when we think about advanced directives, right? To have a notion, okay, what do we think Islamically, you as an individual, right, is acceptable form of death or criteria for death in Islam, to your notion, right? So it could be brain death. We didn't talk about that. It could be cardiac death, right? There's debates on brain death. But there are some states that allow you to have exemptions from brain death because of religious convictions. Some allow you to have accommodations for brain death. I mean, before they do the exam, they would ask you for informed consent. Most people on the bench who are making decisions don't know that, and most people who are advising them don't know that. But
Mhm.
we should have a notion, okay, this is the sort of death in my will, in my whatever, that I think is logically consistent with the Islamic tradition, right? Then what sorts of kind of medications, not medications, what kind of organ donation decisions you want to make, right? What types of organs, to whom, when, what does it look like? Okay. Then then ACP talks about what kind of treatments, right? Do you want to forego or not forego? We all talk about DNR, but DNR is not really
What's
it could be a
DNR?
question. That's the DNR is do not resuscitate, right? If my heart stops, do not resuscitate. You can certainly fill those questions and things out, but they talk about these living wills talk about, do I want to have this sort of quality of life or that quality of life, and so on and so forth. And in the Islamic tradition, you can't really make that decision in a sense and be binding because you don't really know. Some people might know, but most people don't know. So it's more about having a conversation. Okay, well, I don't want to be in this sort of state. I don't want to be in that sort of state, and having a conversation with your family about what that looks, what a good death looks like. And then we kind of have this form. We also have had conversation, but it's very nuanced because it's state law interacts with who's your decision maker, right? We might have priorities of decision makers. State law, almost all the states have their own priority, and it might go against. Some of our families have weird family relationships. Sometimes people have 2 wives or 3 wives, right? Some people have estranged parents, and who do you want making decisions for you? You have to spell that out. Who's your wali? They're culpable. We don't do that. So that's one form thing. The second thing is actually how to meet death, right? So there are very few manuals that we can find contemporarily that talk about how do you think about a good death, right? Beyond the conversations. So we have Rasulullah's example,
Mhm.
right? But we don't talk about that enough or engage with that enough. The Catholic Church, when the pandemic, not this pandemic, when the Black Plague was happening, had these books, manuals to Ars Moriendi. Ars Moriendi was still used in 19th century United States, initially from the Catholic Church, but then the other Christian denominations amended it, right, for their own needs. Where's the Muslim response? We just went through a pandemic, man. People were dying left and right. What do we do? So we are imbibing the death-defying culture and not knowing the yaqeen, which is in the Quran, right? حَتَّى يَعْتِينَ الْيَقِينُ وَعَبُدُ اللَّهَ, right? The yaqeen is certainly is death, but we have not prepared for it. So that's the large project, and I haven't been able to engage with it because I'm all immersed with this academic stuff, but also because you need to bring all these people together and you need to have a funding stream and say, okay, let's think about state laws. What state laws have what? Let's think about what forms people need. Let's think about the hadith. Let's think about this manual, right, of the good death from Islamic tradition. And we're not there as a community, you know.
It's a very interesting point. I've done a number of khutbahs on death. I've done a number of podcasts on death, but
Mashallah.
um, you forget about this aspect of death, which is the material preparation behind it. We talk about the spiritual preparation always, but the material preparation of, when we talk about Islamic wills, right? Like, what are you going to leave behind? Who are you going to leave behind? If in a specific instance this happens to you, what do you want the response to be? So I think, it's a very pertinent topic in today's age, especially like you mentioned, we're just coming out of a pandemic.
Right. So I'll share with you. So I would like to hear the khutbahs. Maybe you can give me some guidance.
Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah.
But the thing that's interesting is I see as someone who people reach out to, both ulama, lay people, and others, right, as just some liaison between these sort of domains of knowledge. I see the problems of that, right? I'll tell you, there was a legal case in law in court, right, where a Muslim family brought a suit against a hospital system because the hospital system wanted to withdraw life support, right? And there's several cases like this, but this one it was recent during the pandemic, and they said that they can't withdraw life support because it's anti our tradition, our religious tradition, which is first principle is hifz nafs, right, preservation of life. They had an imam, a local imam, give them some sort of writing that you should keep your family member on life support at that time during the pandemic, which was on a ventilator, right? Just keep them on because hifz nafs is a thing to prioritize. And they said that this healthcare system is discriminating against our religion, right? That was the suit. And what was interesting was that the healthcare system, they sought me out for guidance, and they wanted me to help adjudicate this matter, or whatever. They wanted me to be the expert witness for them, because they said, well, the individual themselves has some sort of living will that talks about not wanting to be on, life support if they can't come back to walking and talking, whatever it was, right? And then the treatment that we're applying here, this ventilator, more than half the people die on the ventilator, right? Like, this is not a cure.
Yeah.
This is a pandemic. The person got COVID. What are we talking about? But we certainly don't want to go to the press and have these Muslims saying that we're discriminating against them, because in the pandemic, everybody's worried about the healthcare system right now.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very interesting because that family system went to the legal court, filed a case, had an imam say something, right? And then I said, I don't want to be sitting across from an imam in cross-examination telling him why he's wrong or why I'm right, or I'm not doing that. But it's all misinterpretation of what's happening here, right? There is no treatment, right? There is no treatment. And I mean, what are you, like, it was really problematic. And so I said, what I want to do is I want to have a conversation with the family. And they said, well, we can't do that. So they asked me to give some testimony. I said, before it goes to court, we have this, right? And I spoke to the family. And so the imam quoted some papers and our fatwas from Majma' Fiqh Islam. And then I said, well, here's my exposition of that fatwa. Like read the fatwa, like understand what they sort of said, right? As opposed to just quoting the fatwa. And then the imam didn't show up. I said, let's have a mediation. They didn't show up. And I said, listen, this is not an issue of against Islam. This is right. We just don't understand the concept, the dialogue that's happening here. What's going on? It's just a lack of information and understanding, right? And if there was an Islamic issue here, I would be on your team, telling them that they're trampling upon our faith, religious freedom. But there isn't, because we don't understand what's happening. And that's what I'm saying, right? That's one example of when we went to court, man. We went to court, right? They got lawyers. They wanted to put Muslims against each other. It was like this phenomenal. And I wrote this long statement. I said, just take this statement. In the end, alhamdulillah, they withdrew life support. But they weren't given the tools to think about that. And so that's my concern, that we have tropes and elementary understandings, and then obviously in an environment where we fear that there's all these people out to get Muslims, right? We will be heightened to that sensitivity. And I have data behind that for Muslim patients. But I'm just telling you that it's our we just don't have good tools and resources and understandings, right?
But there's also another element, which is the emotional element,
Yeah,
right?
no
So,
counselors.
right, so a person sees, their family member on life support, and they see that the person's still alive, right? Because they're still on life support, but the doctor tells them that the person's basically dead. But it's for the person to let go in that moment is so difficult that they will find every excuse possible. Who knows how many imams they went to before they went to that imam?
No, I agree. I agree with you. That there's an emotional toll, and so that also we don't have counselors and advisors there, right, who can speak the language of both Islam and medicine and chaplaincy, whatever else it is. There are many Muslim chaplains who have never studied anything on fiqh,
Hmm.
right? There are many imams who have never set foot inside an ICU, right? They still think of medicine as healing and curing, when medicine today, by and large, is about chronic disease management,
Hmm.
right? There are many patients or individuals, as we are not patients yet, who have never talked to their families about their own medical problems. We have families who right, just don't talk to each other. And we find out, oh, someone passed away. Wow, they had stage 4 cancer. Oh, I never knew. We don't want to talk about these things. How do I mean, like, we're just, it's a weird, it's weird for Muslims to be at that stage, but that's where we are. And it's sometimes worse in our industrial nation, in our sort of Middle Eastern nations, where 50 years ago they never saw a tertiary care system, and they hear about, we can do quadruple bypass, and we can have a artificial heart, and we can have, right, like, they've never, the parents died, right, without primary care. Now we have these mega instruments of the West coming through, and we don't know what to do.
Hmm.
And I don't want to end our conversation here, but well, meaning I don't think this is a great space for us to leave something. We should talk about something else. But it is just concerning for me, right, that we are reacting in a visitor model to a enterprise, right, a biomedical enterprise, without the first understandings of how it came to be, what is that, and then we always say, scholars say, oh yeah, take the good from the bad, but as you said, like, what's good and bad in this, like, right, where are these things happening? So we have to inshallah ta'ala think about preparing for death in a way that's consistent with our tradition, using exemplars from our tradition, thinking about the fiqh needed, thinking about the adab. I started the conversation with adab, right? What's the adab approaching death? What's the akhlaq you have to embody? What are the fiqh aspects you need to take care of? And we should be doing that. And then when I'm advising my parents, or my parents are my responsibility, I'm the wali. How many of us ever talk to our parents about, well, what do you want me to do
Hmm.
when you're in that state, or God forbid?
But Dr. Padela, I think this might be a good place to end off on.
To end on death? Yeah, okay.
Just, I mean, for me, this is really a wake up call, of trying to begin this conversation with my family, and just trying to approach the topic. We always talk about Islamic wills. Actually, we don't talk about Islamic wills enough, and just preparing for death from the material and spiritual reality. So,
Yeah, and I will say, because you mentioned wills twice now, there are rulings that this Islamic will, or the Islamic construction of will, like the living will that we talk about in healthcare proxy sort of forms, are not necessarily valid. Um, as I just said to you, can you really
mhm,
know the state that you're going to be in, right? And yet, when we have that written, then the healthcare system will say, okay, that's the values that were put by the individual. You shouldn't overrule them. So
mhm,
sometimes it's better, as the best things, to have a conversation. It stands up within court, it stands up within the ethics committees, it stands up, right, and you can really have a conversation around, here are the things that I think about, here what I'm worried about, right? And it's much more nuanced than, okay, I don't want to have antibiotics when I am whatever. Like, I
mhm.
mean, just
Yeah.
weird, scenario. So if you want to end with death as a topic, preparing for death, I think that what we as a community need to do is really to have, there are other communities who do this. So I know there's for example, you were just looking at, there's a thing called death cafes, right, where they sit around and talk about death, and there's some prompts, right, or death with dinner or something, right, where you have these cards. They're just cards to make a conversation, right, and say, okay, well, tonight we're going to come together. We're going to talk about this or that, the other thing, right? That's related to death. Normalize the conversation. Not that you're writing down your will at that point, but you're having a conversation. There are many in our community. When I do focus groups on Muslim communities around healthcare challenges, there's so many people who have been traumatized by having to make those decisions with their loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
They palpably have trauma, right? And we have no space for them to talk about these sorts of things, right? So I think we should have conversations around that, and then we can get to decisions. But first, normalize the conversation around death, right? Think about the ways we're praying for death. Then we come up with manuals and so on and so forth. But then we can get to the fiqh decisions and so on and so forth that need to be made. So I wouldn't start with the fiqh as the beginning. I would start with conversation. You know, how we should.
So I think that that's a key point for all of us to end off with, is preparing for death, asking these tough questions, and just having it at the back of our mind, because it is also an excellent reminder of death, right? When you actually start looking.
Every night, what do you recite when you go, and what do you wake up in the morning saying, huh?
Alhamdulillah alladhi ahyana
ahyani ba'da ma amatani wa ilayhi nushur. He gave me life after I was dead. I mean, right? We say the dua. Like, think about it. We say this every morning. Right? Did we think that the night before we were dying?
No.
Allah الذي يتوفى الأنفس حين موتها والتي لم تمت في منامها فيمسك التي قضى عليها الموت ويرسل الأخرى إلى أجل مسمى. Right? So that's Allah takes the souls at the time of sleeping, right? And then He brings them back, right? Whose time is up, He keeps with them, and He brings back those who for a portion of time. And may Allah forgive me. I'm making this. I'm very paraphrasing that verse, but that's the point. It's there. It's all there. We're at arm's length.
Mm-hmm. There's so much more I could say on the topic of death, but I think we'll have to end it there, Dr. Padela.
Allah bless you.
Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khairan. For anybody who's interested on the subject, Dr. Aasim has written a number of excellent publications and excellent books. He's done a number of lectures as well on YouTube. So if you're more interested in this topic, feel free to search his name up on YouTube. And please let us know your comments below. Let us know maybe some other pressing questions. So the next time we do this, inshallah, maybe we can talk about a more positive topic. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. مولانا يا مولانا يا سميع دعانا